interaction must always be considered. The individual, upon entering the laboratory, becomes integrated into a situation that carries its own momentum. In further experiments, we have attempted to analyze a few of the factors that contribute to the force of the situation. The salience of the victim seems in some degree to have regulated the subject's performance. Additional experimental conditions were designed to explore this possibility. In a first condition, the victim was placed in another room and could not be heard or seen by the subject, except that at 300 volts he pounded on the wall in protest. After 300 volts he no longer answered or was heard from. In a second condition, the victim's protest could be heard through the walls of the laboratory. This condition was depicted in the present film. In a third condition, the victim was placed in the same room as the subject and 1.5 feet from him. Thus visible, as well as audible and voice cues were provided. The final condition of this series was identical to this, with this exception. The victim only received a shock when his hand rested on a shock plate. At the 150 volt level, the victim demanded to be let free and refused to place his hand on the shock plate. The experimenter ordered the subject to force the victim's hand onto the plate. Thus, obedience in this condition required that the subject have physical contact with the victim in order to give him punishment beyond the 150 volt level. 40 adult subjects were studied in each condition. The data revealed that obedience was significantly reduced as the victim was made more immediate to the subject. If the spatial relationship of the subject and victim is relevant to the degree of obedience, the relationship of subject to experimenter would also seem to play a part. In a series of experiments, we varied the physical closeness and degree of surveillance of the experimenter. In one condition, the experimenter sat just a few feet away from the subject. In a second condition, after giving initial instructions, the experimenter left the laboratory and gave his orders by telephone. In still a third condition, the experimenter was never seen, providing instructions by means of a tape recording activated when subjects entered the laboratory. Obedience dropped sharply as the experimenter was physically removed from the laboratory. The number of obedient subjects when the experimenter was present was almost 3 times as great as when the experimenter gave his orders by telephone. It would appear that something akin to fields of force, diminishing in effectiveness with increasing psychological distance from their source, have a controlling effect on the subject's performance. The effectiveness of the experimenter's commands may depend in an important way on the larger institutional context in which they are issued. The experiments described thus far were conducted at Yale University, an organization which most subjects regarded with respect and sometimes awe. To explore the problem, we moved our apparatus to a somewhat run-down office building in industrial Bridgeport, and we replicated experimental conditions there without any visible tie to the university. The level of obedience in Bridgeport, although somewhat reduced, was not significantly lower than that obtained at Yale. A considerable amount of obedience and defiance in everyday life occurs in connection with groups, and we had reason to feel, in the light of many group studies already done in psychology, that group forces would have a profound effect on reactions to authority. A series of experiments was run to examine these effects. In all cases, only one naive subject was studied each hour, but he performed in the midst of actors who, unknown to him, were employed by the experimenter. In one experiment, the actors broke off in the middle of the experiment. When this happened, 90% of the subjects followed suit and defied the experimenter. In another condition, the actors followed the orders obediently. This strengthened the experimenter's power only slightly. In still a third experiment, the job of pushing the switch to shock the learner was given to one of the actors, while the naive subject performed a subsidiary act. In this situation, only 3 subjects out of 40 broke off. The results, as I observed them in the laboratory, are disturbing. They raise the possibility that human nature cannot be counted on to insulate men from brutality and inhumane treatment at the direction of malevolent authority. A substantial proportion of people do what they are told to do, irrespective of the content of the act and without limitations of conscience, so long as they perceive that the command comes from a legitimate authority. If in this study an anonymous experimenter could successfully command adults to subdue a 50-year-old man and force on him painful electric shocks against his protests, one can only wonder what government, with its vastly greater authority and prestige, can command of its subjects.